We're looking at Exodus 19, and at the end of the day, the three elements you want to notice from Exodus 19 are God's mountain, verses 1 to 6, God's middleman, verses 7 to 15, and finally God's people, verses 16 to the end. And the plan is I'll give a 5-minute talk explaining the first point, God's mountain, and then it's over to you in groups to talk about Moses and the people. And that's the plan. So I thought, let's try this out now. Let's get the big idea. So, God's mountain, verse 1. On the first day of the 3rd month, after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. So, they leave Egypt, they go through the desert, and after 3 months of going through this desert, they finally reach their destination. It's this mountain, big deal. Well, it is a big deal because it's saying, you have reached God. This was before the tabernacle, before the temple. This mountain is where God lives. And this is where you will live for the next 1 year. The Israelites will stay there for 1 whole year, right up till Numbers chapter 10. Why? Because God has brought them to himself. And that's what it's saying. Verse 3, then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you're to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you're to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. The first thing God does is remind them, I saved you. I saved you. Remember that. You guys saw what I did in Egypt, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea. And the only reason you're alive is because I saved you. And that's important because the very next verse says, obey me. Obey me. It's not obey me and then I will save you. No, it's I will save you. God saves you and then makes you his people. And then he says to you, keep my covenant. Verse 5, now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So, the first thing we see is God gathering his people to himself. And that's salvation. Salvation is not taking you out of something, out of trouble, out of death, out of Egypt. No, salvation is bringing you to someone, to God, to his mountain. You are his treasured possession, God says to them. So that's what I'm going to say in my 5-minute talk. Well, second point. The second point is God's middleman, and that's Moses. And notice that Moses, he goes back and forth between God and the people, God and the leaders. So verse 7. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. It's worth asking, why do it this way? Why does God need this kind of like line manager for his people? And in fact, you notice layers of these management. There's Moses, there's the elders, and then there's the people. And also notice that God makes it very obvious that Moses is his man, his mediator, his line manager in verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, I am going to come down to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. A couple of points you could bring out of this, it's just relationship. Relationship is based on trust. And, Moses really does represent God. You can trust this Moses. He really does have this connection with God. And there's this element of relationship. But secondly, you might also want to bring across the importance of God's word, such that when Moses says something, God is saying something to me. Moses' word is almost equivalent to God's word to them. And then you might like to ask, how does God speak to us today? Or how can we trust this book, the Bible? There are so many obvious questions that come from just these few verses of God using Moses and speaking through Moses to the people. But there is something specific that God is saying in Exodus 19 through Moses, and that is verse 10. So look at verse 10. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes. And then be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." In other words, you have 3 days to do what? To do your laundry. To prepare to meet God. Get ready. You have 3 days. You're going to meet God. Be ready. But also verse 12, there's also this warning, 3 days to be warned. Verse 12, put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them or warn them, be careful that you do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Don't even touch it. Why? Because anyone who touches the mountain will be put to death. Don't touch, put barriers around it. Don't go near, don't go up the mountain. And the point is, God says all this preparation, all these instructions, all these warnings through one man. He says it through Moses, meaning take his words seriously. All the warnings, all the instructions, all the promises, because all of them are from God and all of them are mediated through Moses. And that's the second point. God's middleman, God's mediator, God's Moses. Finally, third point, we turn the focus on God's people. And the question is, will they obey? Will they listen to Moses? And, as you read this last section of verse 16 onwards, you want to take note of the people's reaction, as their reaction to everything that they see, everything that they hear at this mountain. So verse 16, for example, on verse 16, on the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. And it says, everyone in the camp, they trembled. They went, whoa, what's going on? They were surprised. They were shocked. They were fearful. And then verse 17, then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood right there at the foot of the mountain. They must be thinking, if I go beyond this foot, I will die. Or verse 18, Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. It was like standing in front of a volcano. There's the heat, there's the smoke, there are these earthquakes. With all this happening, Actually, the high point of the passage is not the earthquake. It's not the volcano. The high point is actually God's voice. God's voice. That's verse 19. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Now that's interesting. That's really, really interesting, because here we find at the height of the account, Moses speaking to God and God speaking back to this man, to Moses. That's amazing. And then something interesting happens in verse 20, because in verse 20, God, he almost sounds paranoid. Verse 20, the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and he called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up and the Lord said to him, go down. Warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord. And many of them perish while taking selfies on their phone. Even the priests who approach the Lord, they must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Meaning God saying, have you warned them? Have you passed on the message? Have you spoken to them? They will die if they try to come up this mountain, Moses. Have you spoken to them all these warnings? And Moses says to God in verse 23, you already told us all this. You told us to us a long time ago. I've already spoken. They know all this. Why are you telling me this again, God? What's going on? Well, here we see that God takes his word more seriously than we do, and for our own good. You see, when God says something, it's not a power play, kind of saying, I'm God, you better obey me or else. No, when he says something, it's for our good. It is so that we can come to him and, well, not die in the process. And, there are a few things to notice from here. You might like to talk about a trumpet blast back in 13, verse 13. It says that if you hear the trumpet, you can go up. But here God says, there's a trumpet and don't go up, don't come up, you will die. Well, there are a few things to notice here. But also notice verse 24. Because it's really interesting, because after he says, no one can come up, it's just you, Moses, it's just you and me. Suddenly in verse 24, God says to Moses, bring Aaron with you. So verse 24, the Lord replied, go down and bring Aaron up with you. But the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them. I think it's like the second or third time he said this. So the question is, from verse 24, how come Aaron can now come up the mountain and no one else can? Well, what we have here in verse 24 is kind of a shadow for the temple. There are different, in a temple, or there are different sections to the temple. There are different courts. There's the outer courts, there are inner courts, there are the most holy of holies. And here we have the people around the mountain, but they can't go up. And then we have Aaron, but he can only go up so far. But finally we have Moses. And, the wrong application to this is to say that, there's like first class, second class, third class. That's not the application. It's not saying Moses is first class and the people are third class. No, the right application of this is saying, because of Moses, he can bring Aaron up. Because of the priesthood, they can represent the people. Because of leaders, they can speak to the people. And the application then extends from Moses all the way to the people, because they are called a priesthood, a kingdom of priests that will reach the nations. And you might like to go back to verse 6, where God says, you are a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You might like to go back to that. And you might like to point forward, to 1 Peter 2, verse 9, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. It's specifically referencing Exodus 19. But Peter says, all this so that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into this wonderful light, so that you can be a priesthood representing God to the nations. Well, that's the big picture, I think, of Exodus 19. It's got lots of elements to it. There's law, there's narrative, there's covenant. But at the center of it, it's God's salvation that brings us into a relationship with him. I think that's the big picture. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to you for helping out as group leaders. I'm excited for this Saturday. We have 18 students. All of them are eager to hear God's word, to understand God's word. And I pray that you'll be a part of that process, part of that journey, in helping them to see these amazing truths that hopefully we can see here in Exodus 19 and here in the Bible.